Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parabram, Tasmai Shri Gurve Namaha. Om Dhyanamoolam Guru Murti, Pujamulam Guru Padam, Mantramulam Guru Vakya, Mokshamulam Guru Kripa. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Shivam friends, today we will start our next chapter, that is causes of happiness and misery, and this is chapter 115th of third book Utpatti Khand of your Vasishtha Maharama. Now here Valmiki ji is relating, encouraged by the high-minded Vasishtha, Ram lotus eyes became opened like new blown flowers. He shone forth with a pure grace, his heart expanded and his face blooming like the fresh lotus reviving at the end of night, under the vivifying beams of the rising sun. His smiling face shone like the moon, with inward enlightenment and wonder. Then, with the nectar beams of his bright and white pearly teeth, Ram spoke out these words. Ramji said, "What a wonder that the lack of ignorance should subdue all things, as if it could tie down huge hills with the thin threads of lotus stars. Oh, that this straw of the earth, which shows itself to be so dense a body in the world, is no more than the production of our ignorance, which shows the unreal as reality. Tell me more for my enlightenment regarding the true nature of this magical earth, which rolls like a ceaseless stream running amidst the ethereal worlds." There is another great question that worries my heart. What happened to the fortunate Lavana in the end? Also tell me more about the embodied soul and the animated body, whether they are in concord or discord with one another, and which of them is the active agent and recipient of the rewards of acts in this earth. Tell me also who was the sorcerer and where he fled after putting the good King Lavana to his tribulation and then restoring him to his former exalted position. Now it is Vashishji's turn, and he said, "The body is like a frame of woodwork that contains nothing. It receives the reflection of an intelligence as in a dream, and this is called the mind. This mind becomes the living principle and also the power of thinking, but it is as unstable as a boat on the current of world affairs, and it plays the part of a fickle monkey amidst the busy castle of the world. The active principle of life, or the active principle in the body, is known under different names. It is also called the mind, or life, or ego, and having a body for its home. It is employed in a variety of actions. This active principle is subject to endless pains and pleasure in its unenlightened and unawakened state. And the body has no relation with them. Unlike unenlightened understanding also has received many fictitious names according to the various faculties that it exhibits in its acts. As long as an unawakened mind is in its sleeping state, it perceives the busy bustle of the world as in a dream, which is unknown to the waking or enlightened mind. As long as a living being is not awakened from its sleep, it has to labor under the inseparable mist of worldly errors. But the darkness hanging over the minds of the enlightened is put to flight as quickly as the shade of night spreading over the bed of lotuses is dispersed at sunrise. That which the learned call the heart, the mind, the individual soul, ignorance, desire, and the principle of action is the embodied being that is subjected to the feelings of both pleasure and pain. The body is dull matter, unconscious of pain and pleasure. Man of right reason say that the embodied being is subject to pain and pleasure because of its stubborn ignorance and irrationality. The embodied being is the cause of its own misery. The individual soul is the subject of its good and bad actions. It becomes confined in its body because of its irrationality and remains trapped there like a silkworm in its cocoon. The mind, being tied to its ignorance, exerts its faculties in various ways and turns round like a wheel in its various pursuits and employments. The mind dwelling in the body makes it rise and sit, eat and drink, walk and go, and hurt and kill, all of which are acts of the mind and not of the body. As the master of the house does his many acts in it and not the house itself, so the mind acts in its different parts in the body and not the body by itself. Body is just like a house. The mind is the active and passive agent of all actions and passions and of the pains and pleasures of the body. It is only the mind that makes the man. Now hear me tell you the useful moral of the story of Lavana, how he was transformed to a tribal by derangement of his mind. The mind has to feel the effect of its actions, whether good or evil. In order that you may understand it well, listen attentively to what I will now tell you. Lavana was born of the line of King Harishchandra. One day, he was sitting apart from all others of his court. He was thinking to himself, my grandfather was a great king and performed the Rajasuya sacrifice. I, being born of his line, must perform the same in my mind. Having determined so, and getting the things ready for the sacrifice, he entered the sacrificial hall for his initiation in the sacred rites. He called the sacrificial priest and honored the holy saints. He invited the gods to it and lighted the sacrificial fire. After having performed the sacrifice to his heart's content and having honored the gods, sages and Brahmins, he went to a forest to live there for a year. But this is all happening in his own mind. Then, having made presents of all his wealth to Brahmins and other men, he awoke from his slumber in the same forest by the evening of that day. Thus, King Lavana attained the merit of the sacrifice in his internal satisfaction of having attained the merit of the sacrifice. Hence, learn to know that the mind is the recipient of pleasure and pain. Therefore, employ your attention, Ram, to the purification of your mind. Even every man becomes perfect in his mind, in its full time and proper place. But he is utterly lost who believes himself to be composed of only of his body. The mind being roused to transcendental reason, all miseries are removed from rational understanding. Just like the beams of the rising sun falling upon the lotus bud dispel the darkness that has closely contracted its folded petals. This was a short chapter. Let us take another chapter in which the moral of King Lavana's experience and summary of creation and liberation is explained. Again, now Ramji is asking, Sage, what is the evidence that Lavana obtained the reward of his mental Rajasuya sacrifice through his transformation into the state of a tribal, as it was wrought upon him by the enchantment of the magician? Vasishtha answered, I was myself present at King Lavana's court when the magician made his appearance, and I saw everything that took place with my own eyes. After the magician finished his work and left, King Lavana respectfully asked me with the other courtiers to explain to him what had happened. After I pondered over the matter and had clearly seen its cause, I explained the meaning of the magician's spell. This is the way I will now explain it to you, O Ram. I remember that all those who performed Rajasuya sacrifice were subject to various painful difficulties and dangers, which they had to suffer for a full dozen of years. It was then that Indra, the Lord of Heaven, had compassion for Lavana and sent his heavenly messenger in the form of magician to avert his calamity. He takes the king who would make the Rajasuya sacrifice with the infliction of the very many hardship in his dream, then departed on his aerial journey to the abode of gods and spiritual masters. Thus, Ram, it is quite evident, and there is no doubt in it. The mind is the active and passive agent of all kinds of actions and their sequences. Therefore, rub out the dirt of your heart and polish the jam of your mind, using the fire of your reason to melt the mind down like a particle of ice. Attain your chief supreme good at last. No, the mind is identical to ignorance, by which its magical power presents these multitudes and endless varieties of beings and things before you. There is no difference in the meanings of the words ignorance, mind, understanding, and individual soul. As in the word tree, all its synonyms. Knowing this truth, keep a steady mind, free from all its desires. As the orb of the clear sun of your intellect has its rise, so the darkness of your willing and unwilling flies away from you. Know also this truth. There is nothing in the world that you can't see or which you can't make your own, which can be taken away from you. There is nothing that doesn't die or what is not yours or someone else. All things become all at all times. The multitudes of existent bodies and their known properties meet together in the substantiality of Brahman. Just like the various kinds of unfired clay vessels are melted down in the same watery substance. Ramji said, Sage, you said that by weakening the desires of our mind, we can put an end to our pleasures and pain. But tell me now, how is it possible to stop the course of our naturally fickle minds? Vasishtha replied, Here, O bright moon of Raghu's race, I will tell you the proper course for quieting the restless mind. By knowing this, You shall obtain peace of mind and be freed from the actions of your organs of sense. I have told you before about the triple nature of the production of beings. Here below, which I believe you will remember. Of these, the first is that power who assumed to himself the shape of the divine will and saw in his presence in whatever he wished to produce, through which he brought the physical system into existence. He thought of many changes in his mind, like those of birth and death, pleasure and pain, the course of nature, and the effect of ignorance and the like. Then, having ordained them as he willed, he disappeared from of himself like snow before sunlight. Thus, this God, the personification of will, rises and sets repeatedly as he is prompted from time to time by his inner wish. So there are millions of Brahma born in this cosmic act. Many have gone by and are yet to come, whose number is innumerable. All living beings are in the same predicament as Brahma, proceeding continually from the entity of God. Now I tell you how they live and how they are liberated from the bonds of life. The mental power issuing from Brahma rests on the wide expanse of emptiness spread before it. Then, being joined with the essence of ether, it becomes solidified in the shape of our desire. Then, finding the miniature of matter spread out before it, it becomes the quintessence of the five elements. Having assumed afterwards the inner senses, it becomes a suitable elementary body composed of the finest particles of the five elements. It enters into grains and vegetables, which re-enters into the balls of animals in the form of food. The essence of this food in the form of semen gives birth to living beings to infinity. The male child grows into boyhood, to his tutor for the acquisition of knowledge. The boy next assumes his wonderful form of youth, which next arrives to the state of manhood. The man afterwards learns to choose something for himself and reject others by the clear-sightedness of his internal faculties. A man possessed of the right discrimination of good and evil and of right and wrong, and who is confident of the purity of his own nature and of his belonging to the best caste, Brahmin, by degrees, attains supernatural powers for his own good as also for the enlightenment of his mind, and by means of his knowledge of the seven essential grounds of yoga meditation. And here the description is not complete, but the chapter is completed. I hope in the next chapter this will be further explained. And yes, the last chapter ended with the seven essential grounds of yoga meditation. And in the next chapter, the seven states of ignorance is described. Now Ramji said, please sage, tell me briefly what are the grounds of yoga meditation that produce the seven kinds of consummation that are the aims of yogi adepts who are best acquainted with all esoteric truths. You sage must know better than all others. To this, Vasishtha replied, they consist of the seven descending states of ignorance and the seven ascending states of knowledge. These again diverge into many others by their mixtures together. All these states of ignorance and knowledge being deep rooted in the nature of man, either by his habit or training, produce their respective results. Attend now to the nature of the seven states or grounds of ignorance, and you will also come to know the nature of the seven grounds of knowledge. This will be the shortest lesson that I will give you about the definitions of true knowledge and ignorance. One's own true nature is his best, is his highest knowledge and liberation. Whatever distracts one from this knowledge to the false sense of individual ego is the cause of his ignorance that leads him to the error and bondage of this world. Those who do not deviate from the awareness of the self as composed of the pure consciousness are not liable to ignorance because they lack passions, affections, and the feelings of envy and enmity. The greatest ignorance and error of mankind is forgetting self-awareness and diving into consciousness after thoughts of cognizable objects. The space that takes place in the mind between a past and future thought of one object to another, that respite of the mind from thinking is the resting of the soul in the consciousness of its true form. This is past, this is future of a thought, and in between the two, there is the resting soul in the consciousness of its true form. I will take a pause here and I will now explain to you certain traditions that are followed in our society. You must have seen that after completion or after the fulfillment of any of our strong desire like marriage, job, or birth of our babies or marriage of them, these are some of the very much strong desires in our minds, and whenever these desires are completed we celebrate. And how do we, this is the tradition, how do we celebrate? Some people do jagrata, some people do sundarkand, some people do go to the pilgrimage, isn't that? This is a very historical background and long tradition in our, although now we have stopped doing this because we don't know the science behind it, and the science behind this is hidden in this chapter where it is clearly mentioned that when one thought subsides and another thought rises, in between these two thoughts there remains a resting position, and this is the resting position of the soul in the consciousness of its true form. So our rishis, what they did, they made such traditions, and by celebrating, by doing jagrata, by doing this sundarkand, by doing yajna, by going to pilgrimage, this resting position of the soul is elongated so that we can enjoy the true bliss of our own sarup or our own true form. So this was the science behind all these traditions, that after when once we get the desired home for us, we celebrate. We get married, we celebrate. We get job, we celebrate, and do the pious works just in reverence to the God. And this, because one thought has subsided, another has not yet come, so let us celebrate being in association with the God. Let me now continue this chapter. That is to the state of the soul when it is calm after the setting of the thoughts and desires of the mind, and which is as cold and quiet as the bosom of a stone, and yet without the dullness of slumber or dull drowsiness, is called the repose of the soul in its recognition of itself. The soul is said to be at rest in itself and shines forth with its unsleeping intelligence when it is devoid of its sense of ego, destitute of its knowledge of dualism, and lacking in any distinction between it and the state of the one universal soul. This state of the pure and self-intelligent soul is hidden by the various states of ignorance which I will now describe to you. These are three states of wakefulness, known as embryonic waking, ordinary waking, and intense waking. Again, the different states of dreaming are also said to be the grounds of its ignorance, and these are the waking dream, sleeping dream, and sleepy waking, and sound sleep. So these are the 7 grounds of ignorance. These are the 7 grounds that produce sheer ignorance. When joined with one another, they become many more mixed states known under different names, as you will hear by and by. At first, there was the intelligent consciousness which gave rise to the nameless and pure intelligence, which become the source of the would-be mind and individual soul. This intellect remained as the ever-waking embryonic seed of all, which is why it is called the waking seed. It is the first condition of cognition, so it is said to be the primal waking state. The waking state is the next to the primal waking intelligence of God, and it is the belief in the individual personality of the ego. The great waking is the firm belief that I am such a one and this thing is mine by virtue of my merits in this or bygone times. The cognition of reality of anything, either by bias or mistake, is called the waking dream. Examples are sight of 2 moons in the halo, or silver in shells, water in the mirage, and the imaginary castle building of daydreamers. These are the waking dreams. Now, dreaming in sleep is of many kinds, as is known by one upon awaking who doubts their truth owing to their short-lived duration. The reliance placed on things seen in a dream after one wakes from his sleep is called his waking dream and lasts only in the mind as a memory. A thing long unseen and appearing dimly with a strong figure in the dream, if taken for a real thing of the waking state, is also called a waking dream. A dream dreamed either in the whole body or the dead body of the dreamer appears as a phantom of the waking state. Beside these 6 states, there is a sluggish state of the individual soul which is called as sound sleep and is capable of feeling its future pleasures and pain. In this last state of the soul or mind, all outward objects from a straw to a mountain appear as mere atoms of dust in its presence. Just as the mind sees a miniature of the world in profound meditation. I have thus told you now the features of true knowledge and error in belief. But each of these states branches out into 100 forms with various traits of their own. A long continuous waking dream is described as the waking state, and it becomes diversified according to the diversity of its objects. The waking state contains under it the conditions of the wakeful soul of God. Also, there are many things under these conditions that mislead man from one error to another. like a storm casts boats into whirlpools and eddies. Some of the lengthened dreams in sleep appear like the waking sight of day night, while others, though seen in the broad daylight of the waking state, are no better than night dreams seen in the daytime, and therefore are called our daydreams. I have thus far related to you the seven grades of the sound of ignorance, with, 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 with which all their varieties are to be carefully avoided by the right use of our reason and by the sight of the Supreme Soul in ourselves. I think we should now take a rest over here, and tomorrow we will take the subject of seven states of knowledge. Until then, Shivoham, friends.